Hey Ruby,
Yes.
are we on mic?
I just turned it on.
Awesome. Andrew, it looks like your presentation looks great.
Okay, you're seeing the full presentation.
Yep.
It's 1 o'clock. How are things looking in conference room C?
Yeah, 5. Look at that. Already all on time even. I'm so happy. All right, so let's respect everybody's time and get ahead, and we'll go ahead and get started. And everybody else can sort of fill in as they arrive. Yay, that was my welcome. All right.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I'll go ahead and move on. Today's agenda, we've already done the welcome. We'll go through our roll call of task force members, then consideration of 2 sets of minutes, one from September 5th and the other from September 18th. Then I'll be providing a brief report on cannabis applications and permitting, how the processing is going, as well as an update on annual inspections. We'll touch upon what is happening with the farmland protection zone and our revocation process. And then Nara Del Baca will be providing a brief update on state regulations. And that is about it for today as we move our zoning and permitting recommendations forward for final approval by the board. All right, with that said, let's go ahead and get on to our roll call. Do we have William Weiss here?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. And currently my displays are not showing conference room C, just so you know. Jan Coppinger?
Present.
Catherine Vanderwall?
Here.
Rebecca Harper?
Here.
Jennifer Smith?
Here.
Nara Del Baca?
Here.
Robert Geary? Not present, I'm assuming. And then our fire district representative.
Paul Blues, Kelseyville Fire.
Okay. All right. With that said, let's go ahead and move forward to consideration of the minutes from September 5th, as well as from September 18th. Let's go ahead and start with September 5th. And I'll leave it to all of you in the conference room.
Are we gonna have a quorum issue? Because
We're up to 6. We'll be down to 5.
we're down to 5.
I think we'll be fine if it's unanimous.
Okay.
Who wasn't here?
The fire chief's been very.
Oh, okay.
Oh, they're on the house, right?
I don't know. He was here, and he's here now.
Okay.
I'd let him. Yeah.
I'm not trying to disadvantage that.
No, you're all good.
You know, we don't usually have to wonder, okay, if somebody they were attending the meeting, but they weren't voting in the meeting, does that count? No. That's like a
That
late
bill got
post-COVID
signed,
issue.
just got signed last week. The new bag routine,
yeah.
extending Zoom meetings.
Okay.
So yeah.
They are so convenient. I think it helps a lot of members of the public to be able to attend easily.
That's a great question. Probably not to.
Well,
I'll make a motion to approve the September.
oh, wait a second, hold on. Let's see if we have anybody in the Zoom. Andrew, I cannot see the participants.
Here, I'll put them, okay.
Yeah, we have 5 participants in the Zoom room, and I do not see any hands raised.
All right, good. I'm gonna rely on you to call on hands raised, so we don't have access to the whole participants list.
Okay.
All right, so if there are no questions, let's bring back September 5th, 2023 minutes for task force.
Make a motion to approve.
Great. We have a
Second.
motion. Awesome. That was Jan and Nara. All those in favor, vote aye.
Aye.
Is there anyone opposed to the September 5th task force meeting minutes? Nope. Okie dokie. Next is the September 18th task force meeting minutes. This was our last meeting. Got great stuff done. Are there any questions with the task force? If not, we'll check the Zoom room.
There are no hands raised in the Zoom room.
All right, we'll bring it back to task force for action.
I move that we pass the minutes of September 18th.
Motion by Jennifer,
Second.
second by Catherine. All those in favor, vote aye.
Aye.
Is there anyone opposed? Okay, then those are passed. Next, report on pending cannabis applications and permits, including annual inspections. Take it away, Andrew.
Okay, well, moving on. Before we jump right in there, I just want to touch upon this slide. You see it every week. It kind of is a progress report of the overall task force. As you know, we've wrapped up uses permitted with zoning and licensing and permit type. We will be moving on to development standards, performance standards. I'm bringing it up. I'll bring it up again towards the end of the meeting just to kind of start getting an idea for what to do in the next meeting. I've also added this section over in the column with the here different items aside from everything we've accomplished with here, which may not seem a lot for all we've done. We've also addressed these BOS items, early activation, various ag structures. I'll just call it that for now. And storefront retail and C2 zoning, as well as our own items separate from the outline, including DCC and county definitions, consumptions, and events.
If I could just step in.
Sure.
The storefront retail in C2 actually was supervisor generated. And so going forward, that the recommendations from the task force, it will just be integrated into the other zoning districts and permit state recommendations. So it'll come back to them all together. Additionally, that is scheduled to go to the Ag Advisory Committee on October 10th. Thank you, Catherine, for getting that scheduled.
1 p.m.
1 p.m., 1 to 3. And I just sent out our latest version of our table and the written out list.
Yes, and those.
Oh, Dana says there are some people in the Zoom room. Andrew, can you check and see if anybody's waiting?
Oh, yes, I do see that.
It seemed kind of empty.
Okay.
Awesome.
All right. I had them listed as in there, or at least I was interpreting them as they're in there, but they were waiting to be admitted.
All right.
So should we?
To bring everybody up to speed, we have approved both sets of minutes. Andrew was just giving an update. Andrew, why don't you talk about if anybody can see it? I don't know. Yeah. Talk about that March thing again that you just added, because I thought that was really good.
Sorry, this part right here?
Yeah.
Side section. Okay, so for everyone just joining us, we're getting ready to move into our report on cannabis permitting. But before we do so, I'm going to visit this slide, which is in most of our presentations, an outline for the task force. As we've finalized our approval of recommendations for permitting and licensing, as well as zoning, we are now going to be moving into development standards next after the board approves those or makes any changes to those. But in addition, I've added this section over here in this column to look at the other things that the task force has accomplished. We have reviewed the board of supervisor items to date, including early activation permitting, which we've removed from cannabis, various ag structures that were all kind of jumbled in that one resolution, and we kind of had to take apart a little bit. Our recommendations with retail in C2, which have become part of our overall zoning and permitting recommendations. In addition to that, some items we brought up and addressed on our own include covering definitions, both state and county definitions, as well as some specifications on consumptions and events. So with that said, wanted to keep this up here to let people start to think a little bit ahead and what we might be doing next, but I'll revisit that towards the end of the presentation. For now, I'm going to move on to our update. Moving forward, okay, cannabis permitting applications and permits. Well, the title says pending, but we'll go ahead and do some figures on both sides of these. You've got approved projects over here and pending projects over here. To date, the county currently has 141 total approved use permits. Of that number, 107 are for outdoor cultivation use permits, while 25 are for mixed light or indoor use permits. 3 processing manufacturing centers have been approved, as well as 1 more of a processing distribution center. We have 2 use permits for retail sales, although we do have other retail sales in C2 that were use by right. And we have 3 standalone amendments to use permits, whereas other amendments have just been kind of incorporated into the pre-existing use permit and replaced the old one. In terms of our pending projects and what we're looking at internally, which I think our planners would be interested to see this, I'll bring an update to them. We currently have 73 total pending projects. 18 of those have reached the Planning Commission review stage where their staff reports are being finalized and reviewed. We have 34 projects that are in the CEQA review stage. We have 13 projects that are still deemed incomplete, and we have 8 projects with recognized violations that fall in our pending revocation category. Now, that top section is one way to break it down on those numbers. Another way to break it down would be underneath that, and that's why I put that line in there. We have 37 projects that have been deemed complete and are actively moving forward. We have 11 projects that are incomplete. They haven't completed a full application, but we are in touch with them and they are actively working on that and they are moving forward. We have 10 projects that, at the request of the applicant, are currently on hold. We have 7 projects which are potentially abandoned, and we will be sending out a final notice letter to them soon, letting them know that 45 days after the date of the letter we send them, we will be closing their project out, and then they will have a 7-day appeal period if they come back and they don't like our decision to close it out. And then included in that as well is 8 projects that are on the violations list, which are looking at revocation at the moment. Any questions on this slide before I move on to the next one?
If I could add a little bit of detail to the violations category, we did have our first revocation hearing go before the Planning Commission this past week, and the revocation order was approved. So we are anticipating an appeal to the Board of Supervisors sometime this week. And so I do expect it to go to the board and then probably on to Superior Court after that.
All right, thank you. Anybody else or?
Yeah, I've got a question, Andrew. It's Nara. I'm not sure you can see me.
Sure.
What do you have a slide on here about total acreage?
I do not at the moment.
Okay.
I had hoped to get that together as well as providing a few maps, but we're wrapping up our busiest time of year. It's been kind of go since May, and probably it's just starting to slow down, but it's going to stay pretty busy until October. And then over the winter months, really when it gets a little slower and I can dive a little bit more into the analysis of that total acreage of outdoor and mixed light, approved and pending. And also over this winter, over the following year, I'm going to be tackling the analysis of all of our monitoring reports. I remember people saying, 5 to 10 years ago, like, what is cannabis going to look like? How is it going to affect this? And what is it going to do to that? And, there was a lot of speculation. There were a lot of fears. But, I've heard some people comment, we'll come back in 5 years when we have some concrete data and we can let you know. Well, we're getting to that point soon. So I want to be on top of that. So that's kind of a goal for this upcoming year, is to dive into all of those numbers.
Okay. Yeah, because I know what they have at the state isn't necessarily accurate. And I had a question from a cannabis reporter saying,
Oh, okay.
Really as many acres as the DCC says. So,
well, I took a deep dive into DCC data at the request of DCC to analyze their own data for them as part of a grant deliverable. And, if you take DCC data and you just list everything out that's been issued to Lake County over the last 5 years, and then you multiply that, or you basically just sum it all up, you're going to get a bigger figure. But a lot of those licenses were applied to one project year after year after year. So you're going to get multiple licenses, dozens, sometimes hundreds of licenses associated with just one project. So there's still some kind of disconnect in the way we look at our permits and the way that they look at their licenses. But I have a meeting with them later today to address some of these things. So
I saw, it was down 104 acres.
What's that?
There's a report that the state is down 104 acres.
What does that mean? They're done.
Down, do they have?
They've closed down?
But yeah, 104 acres are not in production this year.
That
Down
could
from-
be, in fact, you know what? That leads right into our next slide. Let's go ahead and look at our 2023 annual inspections. Currently, for our 2023 inspection findings, they're still underway. We had 132 projects listed for inspection. That has kind of changed from year to year. An old policy used to be if your project was approved after June 1st of that year, then you were not required to have an annual inspection. We've changed that up a little bit. Basically, if you are growing, we are going to your site. So that's a little bit of a change. But with that said, of our projects, we have 30 projects in total at this point that have opted out for cultivation. There's a few more we got to go visit. Sometimes we show up on site, and that's when we find out they're not operating and they have not submitted that opt-out form. So it's potential, all right, it has the potential to increase. We've received 23 requests to reduce cultivation. So cultivators who are not cultivating at their full capacity. We've seen several well-maintained projects this year. Some were looking really, really good. Some of our newer projects that were more recently approved. We've also seen a lot of projects with little violations that are correct on-site violations, as well as a handful of the high severity violations, generally unpermitted, unlicensed cultivation on the property, aside from what they've been approved for. When we do recognize those, that's when we send them on to Maria and County Council, and they begin the revocation process. In addition to that, our planners are conducting 10-day follow-ups on these inspections. When we do see smaller correct on-site violations, we let them know we're going to, send you your inspection report. And please, a lot of times they're able to correct it and just email us a photo that we can add to their record to show that they corrected those violations, the small things. Moving on from there, inspection issues and concerns this year. One thing we see a lot of new operators out this year, which is kind of concerning. It's where we're seeing a lot of the correct on-site violations, to where, what happens quite often is, there's a permittee, they were the original applicant, they applied for a project, they may have property owner approval to operate that project on the property, and they get approved, and then they hire a team to manage the farm, and that team has been managing the farm for maybe 1 or 2 years. This year, we've seen a lot of those teams maybe move on to other places, or for whatever reason, they're not involved anymore. And so new teams are being brought in, and those new teams, they weren't around in the initial approval. And what we're noticing is they're not always fully aware of what's in their conditions of approval and what are our local regulations. Some of them may have worked in other counties with other standards, and they come and they're like, yeah, I know how to do it, but it's a little different here. So, that is one issue that we've been seeing this year. Another issue that I think we're just going to continue to see is retroactive ordinance requirements. Farmland protection could be one of those, the ordinance 3106 for the requirements of hydrology and reporting on water impacts to surrounding uses. A lot of the early projects, the really old ones, they didn't have this level of requirement, placed upon them. And so they weren't used to operating with, having all of those figures in the reporting of their monitoring reports. So that's something to keep in mind as we continue to update our regulations and requirements, keeping our permittees aware of those updates. Next one, we have run into a handful of situations with conflicting information from the county and the state, whereas past state inspectors were kind of telling people one thing while it wasn't exactly aligned with what the county allows. So we've noticed a few of those reports. I think 2 that I know of, 3 where the permittee pursued the recommendations of the state and submitted paperwork to the county. However, it was during times where staff was turning over basically, and it or was emailed to the wrong planner who no longer worked here. We've had to dig up some of those discrepancies and address those issues accordingly. Other issues or concerns, we see violations that are not related to the project, in which case, more often than not, we have a code enforcement officer with us, and the code enforcement officer is able to point it out and let them know how to come in compliance, and then we do follow up with those. Especially some of our 10-day violations, if they haven't followed up with the planner in that time, we kind of pass it over to code enforcement at that point, and they will pursue it for the rest of the pending violation process. One item I did want to bring up, which may be something that this task force might want to discuss. We have seen a good number of RVs on site, and the county does not currently allow for that. There is the possibility of getting a temporary building permit for temporary structure in pretty much in a situation where somebody's going to use an RV on site with the right, standards, and during the process of while they're building a house. Now, in some cases, this started back with Article 72, to where commercial cannabis could be an accessory use to a primary dwelling, where a small number of projects started moving forward with building a house to allow for that. Then those regulations were changed. So with that said, as we do see more of these, it is a violation, but some of them, they're perfectly operated projects. They're doing everything according to what they're allowed to do, and then they have an RV there. We generally send it to code. That's really, it's a violation of our county code, and code enforcement will address it. But discussing it with building and certain requirements for septic and plugins, it's something that the task force may want to consider bringing up as a topic. We do have one hand raised in the Zoom room. As I wrap up that slide, I'm going to go ahead. It looks like Holly Harris.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, because my microphone wasn't working before. So I just had a quick question on the 30 projects that were opting out. Were those, it said out of cultivation, were those mostly outdoor cultivation? And does that mean that there's not really 107 outdoor, but there's actually 77 outdoor?
Well, there's 107 approved outdoor projects, whether they're cultivating or not each year varies. 30 have submitted opt-outs. I did go by a site last week. It was an outdoor cultivation opting out, but they had chosen to pursue the temporary hoops for outdoor. And for that, generally for the outdoors, we can use our Planet Lab satellite imagery, which is, closer to real-time satellite imagery that we, submit a request and get it within a day or two. And it could be, a few days ago. It's not like right this minute, but it's within the week. For most of our outdoor cultivations, that has been a pretty handy tool to use, so we can save staff time and from going out on site. However, the one that was using the hoops, as we noticed that, and some of these are under the hoops, we got to get out there and just measure it on the ground. So last week, I went out there and measured all of the cultivation for that project.
Okay, so I guess my question is more, when they're opting out, does that mean just opting out for that year?
Yeah, entirely.
Okay, and
no
how long do
cultivation.
they have to opt out?
Once a year.
Once a year for every year?
It's generally out. Well, it's not necessarily only outdoor, but yeah, they opt out once a year. They get a tax bill once a year. They can opt out of cultivating. We confirm that they're not cultivating, and then they do not receive a tax bill.
Okay, but wasn't there a time limit on how many times you could opt out?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, I thought it was like 2 years or something, but.
Oh,
okay.
if a project goes 2 years without activity, then the permit expires. But,
Okay.
The standard that was set in place when opt-out became an option was that as long as they're paying their annual inspection fees, they're working with us, they're showing up at the site visit to show that they're opting out, then they're actively maintaining their project.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
We have one other hand raised. It's maybe Angela, or it could be wrong.
It is Andrew. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. So I don't know if this is the right topic to bring it up under or a different one, but I had sent you an email asking you about a crop report. So
Oh, right.
unless I'm gonna ask it here. So will there be a crop report done for this year? Because last year's Lake County's crop report, they did not include cannabis. They said there was going to be a separate cannabis crop report done.
Okay.
So is there any plans to do that?
Well, I think Catherine's in the room. Catherine Vanderwall, our ag commissioner. She probably made that comment. Yeah, at this point, it would have to be a separate report because the ag department doesn't receive that data directly. I guess, going back and monitoring or
Okay, go ahead and
analyzing.
defer to Catherine on that one.
Go ahead.
Thank you. This is Catherine. So yes, so for the 2022 crop report, there will be an addendum for cannabis. It's not going to have a lot of detailed information that the traditional crop report has because we don't have a lot of that information available to us.
Okay, thank you. So I guess so Andrew, would that be something that we should look at for future years? Like it should be as detailed as every other crop in the county, right? If we're comparing them. So I'd hope that, so that we have some, like you're saying, a 5 year, so we know what it's looking like 5,
Yeah,
10, 15 years down the road.
Hey,
Sure.
Angela, I can take that one. We're gonna leave that in the
Yes.
ag commissioner's purview. So I don't think we're gonna start our end generating a secondary crop report. So as soon as the whatever has to happen to integrate cannabis in with the other non-cannabis happens, then we'll leave that to the
We'll just
department.
watch for it in with the regular crop report. Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Of the opt-out and the permits to reduce their growing sites, is that a trend that we're seeing? Is it going down? Or is this just normal year to year and it's been the same year after year? I'm just wondering, looking forward, are we gonna see a decrease maybe, or?
It's a great question. We're 2 years into this option. The numbers are up slightly compared to last year, but pretty similar, actually. I think just more people are aware of it this year than they were aware of it last year. It's hard to say what the future holds. I know the market conditions have not been stable, and that's, a big factor in why people have opted out. But it's more than just market conditions. It's logistics, where you're located at, who you're working with, a lot of stuff that goes on the industry side of things that, we aren't involved in. So maybe Jennifer Smith, if she's there, she can maybe speak a little more to that from that point of view.
I think market conditions have dictated the number of farms that have opted out both locally and at the state last year and this year. We might see a plateau from this year to next year. The anecdotal conversations have been, if you can survive the last 2 years, then you should be pretty stable in the market. So we're hoping to see that trend stop.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, with that said, this slide is pretty much wrapped up. Let's go ahead and move on to the farmland protection zone and revocation process.
That's number 6. We still have number 5, which is, nope, you're totally right. Keep going. I was not counting right.
That's all right. Well, we already touched upon some of our revocations. Maybe Maria, you can get into the process in more detail. Farmland protection zone update, not a whole lot to update on it. As you know, it was Ordinance 3101 and 3103 that required the conversion for outdoor cultivators approved within a farmland protection zone to convert to mixed light or indoor cultivation within greenhouses that are fitted with air filtration systems for odor and contaminants. That's a pretty tall order for some of our approved outdoor cultivators. And sorry, I'm admitting someone who probably wants to maybe speak on this topic. Basically, of those that were already approved for outdoor, and I know we've kind of gone through these numbers again, and depending on how you're counting them, they're not always consistent because a handful were moved forward after the ordinance went in place, so they were able to change their plans and just plan on a project that meets those requirements, as it moved forward and was approved. But there were a few that had already been approved for outdoor, which were required to convert. That deadline has passed. That was May 21st, 2023. The task force had touched upon extending that deadline. However, at that time, it wasn't an option. And it really probably wouldn't have made any difference given the timing. But then later the topic went up to the board, and the board discussed it and decided that they did not want to do anything, I guess, make any kind of special rules or recommendations for the few people who are caught up in that tough situation. So for those projects, technically, since they didn't meet those requirements, they are in violation of their conditions of approval and would be on the revocation list. However, Maria, maybe you could speak more to it. You've got other more high severity violations that you are focusing on first. So
yeah, we have a number of projects, and so the priority is the high severity violations, the unpermitted cannabis cultivation. And so, as we discussed when we were talking about this with the task force, they will go on the revocation list, and I will get to them eventually, but they're not a priority right now. So I think that I remember it was over a series of meetings, and I went and spoke with county council, and they don't get revoked until I take them to planning commission. And so it was with that information that the task force decided not to take any action on a recommendation for that. So, however, the farmland protection zone could be taken up as like a development standard, because it's very similar to like the buffer zones that we have. And if the task force wants to deal with it at that time. Otherwise, we've got a little while, because it took me a year to do this first one, revocation. And so I do want to get to them faster, at least the high severity ones. So, but there is still just one of me.
yeah, and while that is happening, we have 4 that were approved for outdoor, which need to convert. I am actively working with 3 of the 4 at the moment. One of them had made some modifications. They thought they were meeting the requirements. They aren't, so we're discussing how they can go forward. Well, I guess there would have been 5. One of them was the recently revoked permit at the planning commission that's moving forward. I'm not necessarily working with them until they deal with their other situation. But there are 3 that I'm working with to kind of help them get their plans, get their engineered drawings, get their elevations, figure out whether, the scope of that change was covered in the initial study the first time, which in a couple situations it was like that. Others that it wasn't covered, how to get the information we need to recirculate a new initial study that can move forward in order to get them to where they need to be to make that conversion.
Right.
But even the one that was in that situation is just looking at getting it in a decent enough place so that they can sell the property and the permit. So.
And I think some of the permittees also might be waiting to see if it changes, see what the policy ends up being, if the changes with the ag structures would help improve their situation, because it's really rough when laws change retroactively, and you're because they have to deal with the state for one type of permit, and now all of a sudden it's been changed, so it's expensive. So if the task force would like to bring up farmland protection zone as an issue to discuss when we get to development and design standards, I'm seeing nodding. Is that general consensus? Then we can definitely talk about that when we move on to the next stage. Because I don't know if the board would deal with it if it weren't brought to them as a recommendation. And so instead of waiting out the director and her being, taking her time getting to them, we may want to develop a recommendation if we want to make any change.
So a question to that point, if I may, and I realize this puts you on the spot more than it should, but I mean, if the board of supervisors already said that they didn't want to change anything related to this earlier, what is the thought toward what a different recommendation from this group would even be received as, like,
Did they make a statement later after the ordinances saying they didn't want to address that situation?
sorry, I thought that was something that you just said, or that Andy just said, wasn't that just said?
Did you just say that, Andrew?
I did, as the temporary hoop house or hoop structure, ag exempt structures, was moving forward this past spring. It was brought up at that time, and the board was pretty clear that no, this is not an issue where we want to address at this point, especially given the limited numbers that it permittees that it affected. So
It does ring a bell. Yeah.
but with that said, some people had been waiting. You know, you mentioned waiting. Some of them were waiting to see if those temporary hoops could satisfy the requirements.
Right. So
However, it
not
was
at this
determined
time
they
doesn't mean
would not
no,
do it.
never.
Yeah.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
That was.
Yeah, no, that was a good question.
Okay, and then the other question I had was, it took a year to do a single revocation.
Yeah.
What's, I mean, without any matter of disbelief on my part, what can you,
Right.
what that entails? I mean, what's the?
Oh, well, actually, it's not that much. The planning staff and code enforcement staff that performed the site visits both made reports. We kind of waited a little while for the sheriff if they had a report, but we didn't get one from them. And then it was just purely a matter of me doing the staff report and running it by county council. We wanted to make sure that the staff report is like spot on, because this is a decision that costs people hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so we do anticipate litigation. And so we just needed to make sure that it was pretty rock solid going forward. But a lot of that time delay was strictly because I don't have the time to pay attention to it. So, but now we've got a good template, and I think that we'll do better going forward, because we want to make sure we get to it as we address the situation in a timely manner, not one that's delayed because I have other things to do. But one thing that's encouraging is we do have a posted job right now for principal planner. And that is the person that would oversee the planning division more directly and would have more time to actually help with the more complicated planning projects.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
Okay. That reminds me, there was one occurrence that happened recently to where a project that we identified as, you know, being in violation and falling in that revocation category. And with that, a notice of violation was posted from code enforcement, and they chose to take the option to appeal that notice of violation. So it's the permittee in their own way kind of expediting this process and taking it, they'll be taking it straight to the board. So
Is there a gray area? What would they appeal? I mean, if they had a few extra acres growing, if they shouldn't, what could they possibly
This
appeal?
was 3 extra acres. And there's an interesting, what I'm guessing, have we seen that appeal yet? The basic.
yes, I have read it. I mean, are we in a place to openly speak? I guess it's public domain data, but
It was
information.
filed. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a public document.
You know, part of their argument is just varying definitions, you know, from my understanding after reviewing it, and, you know, what would that definition be for cultivation area versus canopy? And there have been changes and updates since the time this project was permitted in the early days versus, you know, updates to our tax ordinance and other various updates that are part of it.
So that appeal goes straight to the board. It's an appeal of a code enforcement decision. So it'll be really interesting to see what the board does, because it's not on them to revoke a project. They either approve or uphold or deny the appeal, at which point we'll have a better understanding of how to go, because that one would be pretty high up on the priority list for a very high severity violation.
And that was last Thursday.
It was last week sometime.
Thursday, the planning commission.
These are 2 different projects though.
Yeah, 2 different. Yeah, this one is a code enforcement appeal, but last Thursday was the first revocation.
They did not appeal the revocation. They went to.
They have a 7-day appeal period. So
Okay.
2 different people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I am expecting an appeal. They pulled multiple copies of our appeal.
Yeah, I think we had
application.
5 appeal forms
Yeah,
requested
we've
at the
got
counter.
a number of different people with a bunch of different lawyers, so I am anticipating one of them will submit an appeal,
Yeah.
at least.
Army of lawyers.
it's huge, I totally get it. So
Yeah.
but it's not something that we take lightly either. This is not what I want to do. What I want to do is help all the permittees who are working hard to be legal. That's where we really rather spend our time.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, let's
Go ahead, Andrew.
move on to our next agenda item. An update on state regulations. Nara, I'm going to let you take it over from here.
Okay, so I'm gonna stick with legislation and regulations today because the regulatory process is its own animal and I don't want to be here forever. But what I can do, I'm just gonna do an overview of the way that the cannabis,
Nora, before you get started,
Yes.
Andrew, can you double check, make sure we don't have any hands raised for public input on that last item?
We do not at the moment.
Okie doke, awesome. Go ahead, thanks.
so I'm gonna go through a list of some of the bills that went through and were signed last year and where they're at, and then I'll go into the bills that were introduced this year. A couple have been signed already, but most of them are still, if they were passed through the legislature, they are currently sitting on the governor's desk, and he has until October 14th to sign or to veto those. And I'm going to go through 2021 and 2022 first. There are 2-year sessions of the legislature. So it was the 21-22 cycle, and now this 23-24 cycle. 21-22, the bills were really, the way that I looked at them were grouped around access and taxes. Taxes was a really big issue last year. And there were a number of bills that were introduced to reduce or overhaul the taxation process. None of those bills made it through. They were all, there was a tax issue that was ultimately addressed in AB 195, which was a cannabis budget trailer last June. And that went into immediate effect. So 195, AB 195 eliminated the previous cultivation tax, which was a per pound tax on cannabis levied against the cultivators, collected by the distributors and then remitted to the state. And that was in addition to a 15-ish% excise tax that was also paid to the state by the distributors, but generally collected at retail, as well as paid by some of the other supply chain businesses like manufacturers and distributors. What AB 195 did was simplify the taxation process. The way that the 15% used to be calculated was this kind of insane algebra from CDTFA that said if you are not going directly to the consumer, then you charge 15% of the an arm's length transaction, and otherwise you're charging 15% of what the CDTFA designated markup rate of that particular product would be. And it turned into a bit of a nightmare, as you can probably imagine, for CDTFA to audit or track or calculate or figure out. And so AB 195, through eliminating the cultivation tax, changed the collection point of the excise tax to the retailer and to the final consumer. And that is the place where the taxes to the state of California are now paid and collected. And that changed at the beginning of 2023. It was actually an effective tax increase. It was not really a tax break, because that 15% is now no longer on that strange arm's length or non-arm's length or suggested markup by CDTFA. It's done on the actual retail cost, which tended to be higher than what CDTFA estimated in their amount. So it's simpler now, which means luckily I don't have to go into the entire explanation, but that did change last year. And that wasn't exactly what the industry was looking for in terms of taxes. And then there was also a 20% return to licensee, which pretty much means that the licensee would be able to keep a portion of the tax if you were a designated social equity retailer, you were able to retain 20% of what you owed in excise taxes. And that was another change. The AB 195 also codified and decreased the number of employees that a cannabis business had to have and to enter into a labor peace agreement that went from 20 to 10 employees. And they shortened the amount of time that you have to be able to show that you're abiding by that portion of the law. There were just this year at least 3 LPAs that are being challenged by the department and by the labor board because they were entered into with unions that possibly don't really exist. And so that's in process. It was some of the larger companies, although I don't know with Herbal going under whether that's gonna stand. So that was the tax side. The other thing that 195 did, and I think we probably will end up having another conversation about enforcement. There are a lot of provisions were added for enforcement. Some of the things I know I've brought to the county before because it did allow for local jurisdictions to try to recoup the costs of investigating unlicensed operators. And that was something that prior had to go, that money went back to the state through the AG, and the local jurisdictions that were doing the investigations weren't necessarily going to see any of that money or any of that or any of the fines. That was changed under 195. One of the big fines that was added is for people who own or manage properties that currently have unlicensed cannabis activities happening on them can now be fined $10,000 per day per violation for allowing that to happen on your property. So it was a potential to capture some money, but they have to also show that management company or owner of the property knew that the activity was unlicensed. There were additional enforcement actions that can be added for some environmental violations as well. So we can, like I said, we can get into that if we do an enforcement day here. There were a couple of other changes to delivery under AB 195, and then let me get into some of the access bills that were signed, and you kind of get a sense of this strange world that we live in every day. The bills that were signed allowed cannabis beverages to be packaged in containers of any material, whether they are clear or not. That was something that during regulations changed 2 or 3 times and affected a lot of businesses that had ordered an opaque bottle or a clear bottle, and then they went back and forth on whether it could be opaque or clear. And so that was fixed and codified. Veterinarians are now allowed to recommend or discuss cannabis with their veterinary patients without fearing reprisal from the veterinary licensing authority. And that was
like they can talk about cannabis for pets.
Correct.
Huh.
I think there's a lot of products that were being sold for pets, and then some people were just medicating their animals. And then when they went to their vet wasn't able to actually talk about dosages or effects or things like that. And dogs are highly sensitive to THC, far more than people. So even though there is potentially a therapeutic dose, it's far lower than is in most human products. And so dogs were, while there's not an LD50 for cannabis, they were aspirating on vomit or dying from dehydration. And veterinarians didn't have the ability to speak to their patients about that. So that was fixed. There was a physician and surgeon bill where they were no longer allowed to deny treatment or medication to somebody based on cannabis use, which was not previously allowed. There was a bill that was signed that made it unlawful for an employer to discriminate against a person in hiring, firing, or to penalize a person based on their use of cannabis off the job. There were some folks were able to opt out of that for certain for certain jobs, heavy equipment, things like that. There was a bill that now that stated that any any location that was licensed by the ABC could have a cannabis event as long as the alcohol was locked up during the duration of the cannabis event, and that was new. And let's see. The California State Department of Social Services updated regulations relating to the investigation of a minor to ensure that when a social worker is investigating an alleged case of child abuse, a parent's use or possession of cannabis is treated in the same manner of other alcohol or medication. And that had been a bit of an issue. There are healthcare facilities certain healthcare facilities and retirement facilities that weren't allowing terminal patients to use cannabis. And that was changed as well last year. One of the big bills that was passed, which is still not, still being discussed and investigated, was on Senator Caballero's interstate agreement. And that was allowing California to enter into an interstate agreement with other legal cannabis states for sale or transport across state lines in order to participate in or get around federal prohibitions, but figure out ways that states can do this. So far, I think California and Oregon are the only two states that have opted into this, and they're both producer states. So we have yet
Washington
to see.
did too.
Did they? Okay, yeah, it's possible. It's but producer state. So the question is going to be when we actually get a consumer state like Ohio or Illinois, or a state where they don't have the means of production that we do on the West Coast. How do you actually get the cannabis across states that are currently under ban without triggering federal issues? And the Department of Cannabis Control was supposed to release a report on how they were going to have that happen sometime this year, and that has not come out yet. So that bill is still, while it was signed, it was nothing's really happening with it. And I think that's last year I hit 105, I hit some of the access bills. And let me talk about what was introduced this year. And I can't pull it up on my computer because the county website blocks these websites, which is
how dare you
hilarious.
Cannabis.
Yeah, and on the Cannabis Task Force, don't talk about cannabis. So
I get blocked sometimes with alcohol sites, or it surprises me, the sites. I'm a planner. I have to do this.
You have to know what you're doing.
Right.
So let me pull it back up. So it's just going to be. All right, so we've got a further extension of Ryan's law, which is the one that I talked about, allowing terminally ill patients to use non-smoked or vaped forms of cannabis with a doctor's recommendation in healthcare facilities. That is now extended to patients over 65 and those with chronic diseases. And that's sitting on the governor's desk awaiting signature. Let's see, SB 700, that's Senator Bradford out of Los Angeles, added to the employment bill from last year that it's unlawful for an employer to request information from an applicant for employment relating to the applicant's prior use of cannabis. So now not even asking about it, rather than it just being a testing issue. One of the big bills that you may have even read about is Assemblymember Matt Haney's bill. He's from San Francisco, and this is expanding the ability for cannabis retailers currently cannot serve non-cannabis food in a dispensary or a lounge or anywhere. There were some, I think a couple of years back, the regulations changed to allow for prepackaged food to be available on site. That's non-cannabis packaged food to be available on site for people. But this is the cannabis cafe bill is what it's being billed as. So the ability for you to go in and get a coffee and food that is not cannabis infused while imbibing or sitting in a consumption lounge or in a dispensary. So that is type 10s, which I know we're all familiar with.
Oh my gosh,
So,
not another one. Another type 10.
Type 10 exists already, but
Yeah.
so you'd have to have a type 10 license, and if you have a type 10 license, you'd be able to potentially apply to have restaurant or a food cart or something like that on site without violating the BCC
I
regulations.
wish they give it different numbers. It's just reminding me of the Bay Area where every highway is like 80,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah, exactly. It also allows for selling tickets to live or musical other or performances, which wasn't allowed. And for having those events on site at a cannabis location. SB 51 is another Senator Bradford bill, and that is extension of provisional licenses for social equity applicants. A lot of jurisdictions, I think our neighbor to the west, to the northwest, is one of the worst in Mendocino in terms of converting provisionals to annual licenses. And the state wanted to ensure that social equity operators were not being punished for the fact that their local jurisdiction was not moving fast enough to get them into an annual license state. So it allows for provisional license for a local equity applicant for retail activities to continue under their provisional license indefinitely. AB 1207 is one that the industry is very concerned about. That's Assemblymember Jackie Irwin out of Malibu and Camarillo as part of her district. It bans the depiction of humans and makes other restrictions on cannabis packaging and advertising, which ends up destroying the branding for a lot of companies and businesses. So it's under this attractive to children thing. So a number of folks use their face as part of their advertising. You would no longer be able to show a human on the packaging or in your advertising materials if this bill is signed, which is a huge cost that I don't know if you want to talk about it all, but not especially okay. But it's a pretty wild issue because it really presents some constitutional questions, whether you own your own face, and the ability to put that on something and whether that's attractive.
And how a face could be attractive to children, yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, exactly.
Like a camel smoking or.
Yeah, and it follows in the lines of Joe Camel, which
Yeah.
is a cartoon.
Right, I could see cartoons.
Yeah, so.
Wow.
Yeah, and cartoons were already not allowed, but this goes further,
It's pretty
and
overreach.
yeah, and it like applies to Instagram, applies to, which has already got a sort of a weird shadow ban on it, but a lot of times what you can show is people doing stuff that looks like fun, and then you have your brand without showing the product or talking about it. Now you're not gonna be able to do that. That one's one that the cannabis industry is really concerned about, just in terms of cost and sort of destroying the brands that people have spent the last 7 years building.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You think they'd want to spend more time making it not look like candy than
Yeah,
Right?
look like
Yeah,
Skittles
or
packages and stuff,
enforcing-
instead of that.
Exactly, enforcing the stuff that you can buy at newsstands and liquor stores and 7-Eleven, right? Those are intoxicating cannabinoids that are not tested, that may have heavy metals or other bad materials in them, that are not necessarily having IDs checked, that are quite attractive. I've seen a bunch that actually look like a package of Skittles, and it's 500 milligrams of intoxicating cannabinoids in there. It seems like that's the issue that needs to be addressed. Those are, they're not checking IDs. It's a potential public health crisis. We saw E-Valley killing people with the unlicensed vape cartridges, like right before COVID happened. And that was because, again, there weren't safety or testing regulations or standards, or the fact that you have to scan your ID every time you walk into a dispensary. They want a record of that, and that's just not the case at some of these places. I know the DA in Alameda County actually just shut down a large operation in Livermore that was doing flavored tobacco and a lot of intoxicating hemp. There was a hemp bill this year, AB 420, that was submitted by our assembly person, Cecilia Aguiar Curry, and ours in Lake County. And that bill was converted to a 2-year bill, so it's still in discussion. That was going to allow for the incorporation of hemp products into the cannabis supply chain. Right now, you're not allowed to have hemp in cannabis. And so it's this bizarre thing where you have these dual markets going. One of whom is not tested, not taxed, and getting through on like a federal loophole right now, and the other that is, taxed into submission.
I thought the purpose of hemp, or one of the things about hemp, is that it was not intoxicating.
Well, they figured out how to make it intoxicating. So you
Right.
can extract and extract and extract down to pull Delta 8 and now I guess Delta 10, which are two kinds of THC that aren't included in Delta 9 is the THC that's included in the by the DEA and is covered by Prop 64. So CBD is not and CBD is not psychoactive, but they're able to get around that and put some concentrated intoxicating hemp into that. So that one's interesting. SB 540 was an attempt by Senator Laird that would mitigate some of the issues in 1207, which is the packaging bill that's so troubling. And it would create a public brochure, implications and risks that would be handed out at every dispensary. And it would also allow for a year of investigations and finding out whether new packaging requirements would actually do the thing that the legislator was hoping that they would do in terms of making products unattractive to children. So that there's a little bit of research and data behind that. And that's out, and that's also on the governor's desk for signature. So that's going to be interesting. Let's see. Assemblymember Jones Sawyer out of the Los Angeles area would prohibit the California Fair Plan Association from refusing to insure anyone who possesses or has previously possessed a legal amount of cannabis. That's also now, what's that?
That's huge.
It's huge.
No kidding.
Yeah, it's also a 2-year bill now, so nothing's going to happen with that this year.
I have to have the fair plan because it's the only insurance we can get in the fire prone area. But if I have a claim, they don't have to pay it because I have a cannabis farm on my property. Wow. So even if the house burns down, it has nothing to do with the facility. Right. They don't have to pay it.
That's not okay.
And let's see. This is a universal symbol bill. So what we're finding is a lot of the unlicensed operators are, and you can find it at most head shops, in one of their windows, they'll have a whole thing of packaging that they're selling that has the universal symbol and the warning label. And so you can take that home and fill it up with your at-home product and go out and make it look like it's a licensed cannabis product. So Assemblymember Lackey specifies that a citation issued by the DCC can be for a claim or representation of a product as licensed without it actually being licensed. That did pass both houses and is on the governor's desk. So another 2-year bill is would require a pharmacy or healing arts licensee that dispenses a prescription drug for a patient that has major or moderate interactions with cannabis or a CBD product to display that on the label as a warning. And that is a 2-year bill now.
Can you explain what you mean by 2-year bill to people?
Yes, so we're in the middle of a legislative session, the 2023 and 2024 legislative session. When a bill is introduced in its house of origin is what it's called. That's either the Assembly or the Senate, depending on who introduces it. The Rules Committee then decides which policy committees it's going to be heard by. So it has to be heard by a policy committee, at least one policy committee in each house. A lot of the cannabis ones goes to business professions, economic development is I think the actual full title. It gets one policy committee, a fiscal committee usually, and then it goes to the floor for a vote. If at any point, any of those committees, it looks like the bill isn't gonna make it through that committee, or if there are significant, amendments that need to happen that they don't think that they'll get to in time, the bill's author can choose to hold that bill in that committee. And at that point, if you're in the first year of a 2-year cycle, it'll be held at that committee until next year.
Is that the suspense file?
It's different than the suspense file is it's kind of the suspense file for each committee, but when people are talking about suspense file, they're usually talking about the appropriations committee.
Okay.
And bills get placed onto the suspense file. Any bill gets placed on the suspense as long as it's going to cost more than $50,000, which almost every bill does. And then the appropriations committee, once it's placed on that file, has a series of hearings where they either move something off suspense, which means it can go to the floor, or they keep it on suspense, which either then the author has to decide to hold it in appropriations for that year, or to let the bill die, if it's at the end of the session. So the bills that are held this year are going to be heard next year, and next year is the end of the session. So they have until next August to get out of whichever house they're in. Thanks. Oh, I didn't cover 1186 from last year, and that one is in the process of getting regulations written for it. 1186 was Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco, and it expanded medical cannabis accessibility. So areas where there's currently no cannabis allowed in the state has proven to be a bit of a health crisis for those who need it medically. They're not able to access it legally or safely. And so this bill would allow for would require that there be some way for a medical patient to access cannabis in those banned jurisdictions. And so the department is looking at what that's gonna entail. But that one was signed last year. And okay, what did we go through? AB 1094, Assemblymember Wicks, would prohibit medical personnel from performing a drug or alcohol test or screen on a pregnant person, perinatal person, or newborn without prior written and verbal informed consent. And that's also now become a 2-year bill. And this bill was up last year and was reintroduced this year as AB 471, Assemblymember Ash Kalra out of the Southeast Bay. Would authorize the DCC to issue a state caterer license, and that would be another new license type, which would allow for a cannabis catering event. And that bill was held in appropriations, so it's now stalled out twice. And that would allow for you to get licensed at the state level, similar to an event license, but it would be catering, and so you'd actually be able to, I think, have the product with you. And I think that's probably where they're running into issues, because there's not a safe storage location.
I thought I've already seen advertisements for like paired meals.
It definitely exists.
Yeah.
It's just, and it would be adding a license type that would make that a little bit easier of a process.
I'm sorry. There's a lot of laws.
It's a ton. It's about 40 last year and about 40 bills this year that got introduced, which is why I was like, oh, I'm gonna get to regs this year. Or this meeting. SB 512 was a bill that was killed in the Tax and Revenue Committee. It was seeking to fix this tax on tax issue that cannabis seems to have, where the state and local jurisdictions can't decide who's the last tax, and you get taxed on the post-tax total. This is a big issue in the city and county of Los Angeles, who both want to be the last tax. And the state has said they're the last tax. And this, in places that are that large, represents millions of dollars. And they sat down last year, decided to have a meeting about it, and both decided that they were the last tax. So really happened there. And what ends up happening is if you don't pay your taxes right to your local jurisdiction or to the state, you can face revocation and loss of your license. And that bill was unfortunately killed. It was a committee that's been historically unfriendly to cannabis taxes. It was the author of the packaging bill, the problematic packaging bill, is the chair of that committee. And she was not pleased about some of the things that were happening to her cannabis bill. And so no other cannabis bills made it out of that committee this year. This is, okay, that we talked about cannabis cafes. There is a cannabis farmers market bill that's been introduced now, I think about 4 times, usually carried by Assemblymember Wood. This time it's carried by Assemblymember Pellerin out of Santa Cruz. And it would require the DCC to issue small producer event licenses. So it's known as the farmers market bill. It would allow for farmers to, at a special event, sell directly to consumers. And it passed the assembly, but is now a 2-year bill. It got held in.
So that would be bypassing all of the testing of the distributor.
It would not, it would still need to be in final form.
Oh,
So,
okay.
it would need to be, it can't go to a consumer without passing final form.
Okay.
What this would do would be to allow a cultivator to apply for an additional license type that would grant them, I think the most recent version was like up to 8 events throughout the year where they could go and to that particular event and sell their product directly to the consumer. So it would bypass the retail.
Interesting.
Yeah. So currently, if you can do something just like that, but you have to have a licensed cannabis retailer on site that the sales go through. So it's not creating too much of what's not already there, but it's a very big and important bill for some of the trade associations, and a big problem for some of the retail trade associations. So that's a battle we've been watching for a few years now. This one's about potency. So there's one about strengthening requirements around potency. And then there's a CEQA bill that was introduced last year by Senator Laird, was reintroduced this year by Senator Laird. And it would provide that CEQA does not apply to the issuance of a state license to engage in commercial cannabis activity if the local jurisdiction has filed a notice of exemption, which seems to make sense, but seems to keep dying. It's been heavily opposed by some environmental groups. Again, I think they're concerned about any chipping away at CEQA.
So as a local jurisdiction, we could issue like a CADX for an existing facility to move into a shop, and then they might make you go through
You still have to
checklist.
You still have to go through a CEQA at the state, yeah. And particularly for retailers where it's like there's very little CEQA issues, very little environmental concern. It's a commercial use going into a commercial use.
Right.
It seemed like it was a pretty no-brainer, but I guess not. Especially because the whole point of Prop 64 was to do local control. And local control should mean that the local jurisdiction gets to say whether there's a neg deck or an exemption or anything like that. So we'll see. That would be a pretty big deal. There was a companion bill introduced by Assemblymember Bonta out of Oakland that was a little bit more expansive than the Laird bill, and that one died in committee. SB 622, that Senator Allen would allow for plant markers to be somewhere other than at the base of each plant. Right now, you have to, every plant that goes into the flowering area has to have a tag, plastic RFID tag affixed to the base of the plant. And it gets to be a headache. It gets to be impossible to find or see if that plant gets large. And it's an immense amount of plastic waste. If you think about the thousands of plants on an average farm
And labor.
and the labor of
We
it.
have to do it twice.
That. Okay. And I talked to the sponsor of that bill today.
Where else would you put it?
Well, the idea would be that the plant would still have a unique identifying number, but it wouldn't have to be affixed to the plant itself. So that would just be inside the system. You would say numbers 2235 through 2345 are in this row.
You have a QR code at the beginning.
What is the point of that for them each to have their own ID number like that? Just out of curiosity.
Track and trace, it's supposed to be about safety. If there's a product recall, you can track that all the way back to the individual plant farm. The software company that received the license, the contract from the state, made their product, not the software, but the tags. And so they were getting paid for every tag that had to be ordered by the farmer. So there was, I think, a monetary reason for that too. But it ends up making a product that should be completely organic, you know, generate a ton of plastic waste. That's not recyclable because it's got this RFID tag in it that makes it hazardous. And then you've got these giant bags of tags that farmers have to retain for 7 months.
No, you just throw it out now.
You get thrown out.
Immediately.
Can you really
Yeah.
use them?
No.
No.
Jeez, okay. I'm sorry.
I could give you a really long lesson on this, but that would be another meeting.
So the individual ID for each plant would still exist because that would have to be a change to Prop 64, but it removes the physical plant tags, which is just, an immense amount of waste. And that one is on the governor's desk as well, so that did pass.
All right, how many more do you have?
I got like,
I think we're losing people.
I know, it's
I love it, but I'm kind of weird that way. I know not everybody else is as weird as me.
some of these are pretty minor. I'm just going to make sure I didn't miss any major thing. There's an ability, Senator McGuire, who's again our senator, would require the DCC no later than March 1st of next year to establish a cannabis licensing fallowing program for cultivators. The state doesn't currently allow that. And so that would be important. I think
Fallowing, like
fallowing.
opt out?
Yeah, exactly. Like,
Oh,
so cultivators who choose to.
Trying to be more ad.
right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's really interesting because one of the things that we've noticed this year is we've had a couple site visits where they're growing more than we thought, but they come in and talk to us and they said, well, the state said we're not growing enough to even qualify for our license type, and they had to expand. And so there's some disconnect there that sounds like it might address.
Yeah, there's some because you apply based on the size
Mm-hmm.
and you pay based on the size.
Right,
So.
right. And some of the license types are this square footage to this square footage. Actually, all of them except for the new type 5 are very specific. And so if you're minimizing or you're opting out, then you could then have trouble with the state if you're not allowed to follow.
The fine for under canopy is the same as over canopy.
Well, okay. Because that makes sense.
Yeah,
A
right.
lot of things today that it made sense.
Right? It's really interesting.
Yeah,
You know, we just focus on land use here, but there is so many different areas that have to sort of get hammered out with the new industry.
yeah, like business license transfers, which was one that was introduced and died this year. So while the market's in a major contraction. So not to speak about again. I talked about 420, which was the hemp bill.
Okay, give us
So-
one last finale.
Let's see, there's a one. Here's one that'll matter here. Meishenshine expands local government's ability to immediately fine for cannabis cultivation to other cannabis activities.
Wait, what?
Yep. Those are-
Say that again?
It would allow for local governments to immediately fine for cannabis cultivation. For unlicensed cannabis cultivation, I guess you have to go through that process in order to fine people for
We
unlicensed
already have a
cannabis.
process for that. Is the state telling us we don't have a process for that?
The state is there is a process, but I think this makes it faster. I think you had to still go through the AG for approval for something.
Okay.
And our process may vary from other local jurisdictions.
Right.
Yeah, let's look into that.
So that's AB 1684. If you guys want to write that one down. And that's if you want more, there's another 10 or 15 bills I didn't cover, but you get a sense of of what we're looking at.
Holy moly. AB 1564, is that what you said?
1684?
1684, thank you.
Yeah, 1684.
Awesome, thank you. All right, thank you very much. Wow.
Okay, so moving on to the next slide. I'll take that as a yes. Okay.
Yes,
All
sorry.
right. Again, we've seen the slide, but I brought it up at the beginning. It's probably going to be in every presentation. I bring it up here because we are kind of in limbo a little bit until we get that final approval back from the Board of Supervisors on our zoning and permitting recommendations. But, you know, I just kind of wanted to plant the seed now to kind of keep our productivity up. We've been making a lot of really good progress. Maybe we can explore aspects of development standards and performance standards that we can continue to discuss and make recommendations of and apply them regardless of whatever recommendation comes back on permitted and zoning. There's also this section I added here. Compared to an earlier version of this, I moved performance and development standards around just because, you know, we're zoomed really out at 30,000 feet here. We keep zooming in until we're really zoomed in with performance standards. Development standards are going to be more area specific as opposed to site specific on performance standards. There's also the aspect once we get through all the commercial activities, which covers all of this, of the adult, personal, and medicinal cannabis activities. I'm going to stop there. There's a potential for task force members to discuss among themselves what they would like to move on to or how they would like to approach it. Especially we should be prepared for any delays as we wait to get those recommendations back from the board. With that said, I'm going to leave it to the room, and then the next item is public comment, and then that's a wrap. So.
Well, it seems to me that we could work on the development standards review and make any recommendations for any of the cultivation licenses since they've been in place. And there's some changes that could be made there.
Okay.
That makes sense. Yeah. Also on exclusion zones, Andrew, just make a mental note to add farmland protection zones at that time.
Yes.
How long will it take for the board to approve the zoning?
Well, we go to the Ag Advisory Committee, and then Planning Commission, and then Board. So it's gonna take a little while, yeah. This is just, this is not an actual ordinance amendment, so it's just their input on it, so it wouldn't have to have like a noticed public hearing, but it does take a little time to get on the agenda.
How quickly can we get on the planning agenda now that we have a date for Ag Advisory?
Good. We can get on the next one after October 10th, so the second one in October.
Yeah.
Keep it moving. And did the subcommittee want to join me for the Ag Advisory Committee meeting? It's in person on October 10th at 1 o'clock at the Ag building, right? Yeah.
Sharon reached out to me separately and asked me to attend, so there. How often we do it?
Excellent.
You set your item first, because there's actually another item that they want to discuss.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
It's amazing.
All right, that's all I've got. Andrew, you want to move on to public input?
Yeah, let's go ahead and move on. Do we have anybody from the public, either present in conference room C or in the Zoom room, with any other questions or comments?
We have no one in C. Don't see any hands raised in the Zoom. Do you, Andrew?
Nope, not yet.
All right.
I guess I can make one final comment. In our listed recommendations that were posted online towards the end of last week, there were some updates for the type 13 self-distribution that didn't get converted over. We took care of that this morning. So just want to let everyone know that.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll go ahead and adjourn then.
Thank
October
you.
11th, the Lakeport Planning Commission is gonna have a cannabis item.
Oh, really?
Mhm.
What type?
Events and, allowing.
Ooh, you guys just cut out on us. Or at least on me. Oh, Ruby left the room. Okay. Okay, well, I guess the meeting is adjourned. For those of us still around, I'm going to call them and let them know that they were cut out, and they should hold off any discussion for the next meeting.